Hi, I'm Gaynolyn Condi, and I am here to share Teaching General Conference episode with you in Living Up to Your Privileges by President Emily Bell Freeman. I was shouting hallelujah while she was teaching these principles, because I feel like we have needed a more articulate way in describing the power of covenants and covenant making and keeping. And I feel like her previous talk and this talk are just really beautiful bookends. And then as you went further into conference, right, not to get off, but on a different tangent, but there were a number of why talks for the church and the gospel with Elder Renlund. And so I just love this talk. And so if you're new to my teaching style, I have a teaching degree, and I do some religious book writing and teaching and hosting. And I also teach Relief Society in my calling in my ward currently right now. So this is my calling, and this is actually the first talk lesson discussion I will be leading from this most recent conference. So I always do a handout, a paper handout. And if you've watched some of my previous Teaching General Conference videos, you know that I really love the tactile paper. I tend to never use PowerPoint unless there's a clip from the video from the original talk that I want to share. The reason I like these tactile handouts, and they will be available in the show notes because many of you have reached out wanting the actual handout and used them in your own lessons and discussions, which I love, is because for those serving in other auxiliaries that can't attend Elders Quorum or Relief Society, this is a really great way to invite those in your class to take an extra one home, write a note, stick it in the mail if you don't live within a vicinity close to your ward members, or drop it off on your way after church, letting them know what the lesson was about. The other thing I do is I post these questions on our ward Facebook page and our group me, so that women and men in the other auxiliaries can be ready for the discussion and ponder on the questions that are given. I don't give all the quotes, but I do give the questions. So I'm going to share a little bit what I have found on this talk that I just absolutely love. Sister Freeman, President Freeman, starts out talking about her husband's recent diagnosis and chemotherapy and taking the sacrament in the hospital, and how she really found that pondering on the gift of that ordinance within a totally different environment than she normally partakes of the sacrament helped her really ponder on the power of heaven that comes through making and keeping our covenants. And so the question that I asked with this first quote is, consider the times in which making and keeping covenants stand out to you. Interesting for me, the last two lessons I've taught in Relief Society have been about covenant making and keeping in the temple. And so I was a little nervous that for a third month in a row, I would be talking about the same principles and topic with some overlap. And in counseling with my Relief Society president, I felt like, okay, third time's a charm. Now we have really, because we have women in our Relief Society that are not currently endowed or at various levels of relationship with the temple. And so I love that President Freeman starts out with the sacrament. Because if you're a baptized member, then that is a ordinance you're participating with each week. And so I feel like everyone can be in various levels of relationship with the temple, but I love that she doesn't skip over the power of the sacrament. And she asks a really big question: who officiates versus who receives? And she poses this question that she had this clarity that it's just as important, not just who officiates in an ordinance or a covenant promise, but who is receiving that ordinance and what is unlocked in their lives when they make an intentional focus on paying attention to those priesthood ordinances and covenants and the promises associated with them. So I love this question. I like to give questions that kind of feel open-ended. And you'll notice in my questions that it's also an invitation to kind of build on some themes. So I tell my class every time I teach, the Lord's pattern is working in one eternal round. And so I am not a teacher that says, let's hurry and get through everything, and once I ask a question, we've moved on. If the Spirit prompts someone in the group to share a thought on something that we discussed 5 minutes or 10 minutes earlier, God's pattern is one eternal round. So I really love building themes. So covenants and ordinances, this quote is, I don't think I had ever realized this. That quote, there's a specific question. If you see on my handout, there's a quote and then the question is printed right there. So the women know what to read. They're not like maybe on their phone and distracted. Not there's anything wrong with that, but then we kind of are just always on the same point. That's the other reason I love the printed handout. So how do covenants and ordinances sanctify and empower us? I think that's one of those big themes that we can keep trying to find words on how that actually happens, because we don't always know how that happens until we're asked to talk about it. The next quote I share is, the Father entrusted Jesus Christ with the keys and authority to oversee the delivery of his priesthood ordinances. Under his direction within the order of his priesthood, the sons of God have been ordained to stand in place of the Son of God. And I really love this because this is an opportunity to have a conversation around power and authority, and why is it so important to have proper authority and power when officiating in these ordinances. The next quote I share is, a portion of this, we don't just make covenant promises, we must keep them. In many gospel ordinances, we make sacred covenants with God. I don't do this in this lesson per se, but this would be a great point to pull up her previous last conference talk and share what she said about this theme then as well. The question I share here is, share a time when you felt the power of God through your covenants. This is where there's the secret sauce of teaching Relief Society and Elders Quorum, is where you come to become a ward family in these witnessing moments where the members of your class get to witness to each other and talk about how covenants really do give us power from God. And when we know that why, I think it changes how we choose to keep our covenants and why we make them, and how we can teach our kids about making them. So another thing that I would love to share is, and you may be aware of this, but there are these little footnotes. If you sign into your account, you can leave these little notes here, and you do that over here on this little side here, right? This is where you can highlight, note, tag, hyperlink, whatever. And so when you're preparing your lesson, it's a really great way to like plan ahead or whatever. But there's also these little footnotes, and footnotes, oh, I knew that might happen. So this footnote seems to be broken. And so I'm gonna do in live time what happens sometimes when we're teaching and we're using technology. So one of the footnotes, when you click on it, it takes you to a quote from the prophet Joseph, from the teachings of the prophet Joseph. And so I love that this little footnote gave me a chance to share a different kind of quote. It's not the quote directly from the talk, but it's referenced by President Freeman. And so you'll see it here. I should have just clicked on right here. This is a side note. I spent some time here. This is where President Freeman is talking about how Emma needed power and she had not been called yet to specific callings. President Freeman also gave a great BYU Women's Conference address where she talks about how if you wonder where women fit into the plan of God, go back and see where women fit in the story of God. And so I'm pulling this from notes that I heard her give in that address, that women were in the council of heaven, Eve, the story of Eve, Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Abish is what I threw in. She did not use Abish as an example, and then Emma Smith. So I remembered that teaching that she had taught in a different setting. And I felt like this was a really good time to talk about the power of women, how Emma needed power but wasn't in a calling yet. And then I found this great footnote where it comes from her whole title of, I thought I had it in my notes, where she references the privileges given to women. And I'm going ahead and I've obviously not saved it in my notes per se. I thought I had it in my footnote here. But it is the quote from Joseph Smith talking about the power that is granted to women. And so I pulled that full quote about her. Oh, it's later on. That's why we're not there yet. Look at me in live time making it not be so smooth. Okay, this is where it is. The prophet Joseph at this point is being tutored in the power of the priesthood. And I love how Sister Freeman, President Freeman, talks about how where Emma was at in her life as a new mom, struggling maybe with finances and mourning the death of her child. What a beautiful place to like really engage in how covenants connect to our everyday life, that they're not just connected to these like big milestone moments or callings. And so I decided to ask the question, patriarchal blessings, as kind of a neutral jumping off point of how patriarchal blessings are a time that come before sometimes we're doing the theme. And so this is where I ask where D&C 25 can help us better understand a relationship with God. President Freeman goes on and talks about how Emma's relationship starts to change. And she goes from a daughter in the kingdom to an elect lady to a queen. And where when we as women specifically study the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood ordinances and we keep our own covenants, then this is where, sorry, I jumped ahead. This is where divine guidance and empowering capacity comes from living and keeping covenants. And so this is where, once again, this is that theme that I have actually been as a Relief Society teacher teaching the last 3 months. How have covenants transform you? Because Section 25 kind of shows the progression of Emma's life. And I just think what a beautiful way to bridge between if you have younger and older people in your congregation and in your class, where someone of a younger age group can talk about how maybe more recently some covenants have transformed in their lives. Maybe that's the first time they've been through the temple, or maybe you call out and ask for the grandmas and the grandpas to raise their hand and give kind of an arc of their life and how covenants have transformed them. I do think that in connection with a discussion on patriarchal blessings is a beautiful way in which we can talk about living up to our privileges. Then this was the preview that I gave you, and I jumped too far ahead because I'm so excited about it, and I'm sorry about that confusion, where we get to talk about this quote from the prophet Joseph, where he originally said, if you live up to these principles, how great and glorious will be your reward in the celestial kingdom. If you live up to your privileges, the angels cannot be restrained from being your associates. What a powerful place where you can pause and talk about, I did an alliteration there. Did you just see that? Where you can talk about principles and power and how we will not, when we live up to our privileges, we have power and association with angels. What a beautiful place to pause. Now, that footnote right here, live up to your privileges, is just a portion of the original quote. So that was just a reminder that you can sometimes click on those footnotes and there's like extra that you can pull into your lesson that wasn't originally shared in the broadcast or in general conference. Okay. The next quote is that I share on my handout is from President Freeman. She gives an invitation. So I formed it in the way of a question. I formed her quote as an invitation to study and learn and better understand how covenant making and keeping becomes more personal and powerful. And she gives specifics about carefully studying and pondering the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood ordinances and the covenant promises we make with each of them and the power of God we have access through these covenants. So this is a great place where you get to just hit that home one more time. And then she ends in such a beautiful way. And this is kind of my conclusion. And I always think there's a great place for a conclusion where the Spirit can take everything that's been discussed, all the answers that have happened, and you get to pause as a teacher and just really let the Spirit direct. This is where I think it's important to stop and know that you can say sometimes, I feel like there's something someone's been wanting to share and they're nervous to share. This final, I always love to give kind of a conclusion quote. And it's usually at the end of the talk because the speakers do their own conclusion. But what I love about this conclusion quote is on the handout I have partaking of the bread and water and then wearing the garment of the holy priesthood and then walking into the temple, and all of those things are such a great like trigger reminder list of what the covenant path really is. And then this is where I think it's so powerful to pause and let the people in your class feel the Spirit nudge. As a teacher, sometimes I go home and then I get a text, when someone in the lesson isn't feeling comfortable to share, and that's perfectly fine. But usually multiple people are texting the same thought and feeling. And if one of those people had felt comfortable enough to share, what could have been fleshed out from that, from those comments and questions. And so I would just say, as a teacher, especially if you keep setting the tone of vulnerability, this is where you get to share about your patriarchal blessing. You get to share about the time you attended temple and were in the temple and maybe had that access to power that you had not previously had, or association with angels. This is a beautiful time to also talk about maybe your own personal witness or testimony of what it takes to make choices to stay on the covenant path, and what times in your life have felt really vulnerable and that covenant power has shown up. Sometimes classes are hesitant. Sometimes you have classes where the discussion stays kind of here on the surface. And I think as a teacher, we can model that vulnerability, we can model that sharing, and check out those footnotes. Those footnotes have gems in them that don't always make it into the final talk, but are in the body of the talk when you go to prepare. And then find questions that kind of build upon themselves. I love a good handout. I'm a paper girl. I love a good handout because it lasts long and you can pass it on. And it's a great way in which you can incorporate people that are serving in your ward and other auxiliaries, and they're not in the lesson with you. So I hope that's helpful. This is a beautiful talk on a complex issue and a complex principle of covenant making and keeping and living up to our privileges. And I'm really grateful to be able to share with you some thoughts on how I'm going to approach teaching this talk by President Freeman. Really, really loved it. It was a hallelujah moment. The whole conference was, but for sure, this is a must keep and return to, and go back to her April talk from 2024 and see how they work so well together.